Dying CEO gave his cleaner a black card. He never expected she'd be his only cure. She cleaned his penthouse with music in her ears, never knowing he was watching. He gave her a black card. But what could a dying billionaire possibly want in return? Have you ever received something so unexpected that it completely changed your life? There's something powerful about silent kindness, those moments where love finds us in the least likely places. This story is about a man who had everything but time and a woman who had nothing but heart. It's about second chances, unexpected connections, and the healing power of love. This isn't your typical rags to riches story. It's about a caramel-skinned American woman named Nova Chandler, a cleaner who believed she was invisible. Each morning she walked the polished floors of New York's elite high-rises, scrubbing away while daydreaming of a life that seemed impossibly far away. But fate had other plans. Elijah Maddox, a fiercely private billionaire tech CEO, was living his final months in silence. Diagnosed with an aggressive illness, Elijah had accepted his fate until Nova entered his life. She didn't know who he really was. She wasn't trying to impress. She just cared. Her kindness cracked open a part of him no medicine could reach. Through secrets, betrayal, and an unexpected love affair, this story will take you on a journey filled with tension, truth, redemption, and warmth. Welcome back to the channel, my beautiful story family. Before we begin, let me say something really personal to me right now. To our growing community, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate every single one of you. I would be glad to know that these lessons get to people in different parts of the world, so please let me know where you're watching from. Now, let us begin. Elijah Maddox leaned against the mahogany desk in his study, the faint hum of the city 30 floors below filtering through the tinted glass. His fingers traced the edge of a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid inside catching the dim light of the late afternoon. He wasn't drinking, not yet. His eyes, sharp despite the exhaustion etched into his face, followed the new cleaner as she moved through his penthouse. Nova Chandler. That's what the agency had called her. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-20s, with a quiet focus that made her stand out from the others who'd come before. She didn't fumble or fidget. She just worked, her hands steady as she wiped down the marble countertops, her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot. He hadn't spoken to her. Not a word. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like she didn't belong here, in his world of cold luxury. Or maybe it was the gnawing ache in his chest, the one the doctors couldn't fix, that kept him silent. Either way, he watched. She didn't seem to notice. Nova, on the other hand, felt the weight of his gaze. She always did when people stared too long. Growing up in a cramped apartment with too many siblings and not enough food, she'd learned to sense eyes on her, whether it was a teacher's pity or a stranger's judgment. But this was different. Elijah Maddox wasn't just some rich guy sizing her up. There was something else there, something heavy. She didn't let it show, though. She kept her head down, her movements precise. The penthouse was immaculate already, too perfect, like no one really lived here. Still, she cleaned. It was her job. The day stretched on, the silence between them thick, but not uncomfortable. Nova finished the living room, the kitchen, the hallway with its framed art she didn't understand. She was about to pack up when she noticed a small table by the front door. On it sat a sleek black card, glossy and unmarked, next to a folded piece of paper. She hesitated, glancing toward the study. The door was still cracked open, but she couldn't see him anymore. Her curiosity tugged at her. She shouldn't touch it. It wasn't hers, but her fingers brushed the card anyway, cool and smooth against her skin. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. Use this as you please. Come back tomorrow. No signature, but she knew who'd left it. Her breath caught. She turned the card over in her hands, its weight unfamiliar. A credit card, a gift, a trick. She'd heard stories about men like him, wealthy, reclusive, playing games with people like her. But this didn't feel like a game. It felt like a question. Nova slipped the card and note into her pocket, her mind racing. She grabbed her bag and left without looking back, the elevator ride down feeling longer than it should. Outside, the city buzzed around her, but all she could think about was that note. Use this as you please. What did that even mean? She stopped at a corner store, the kind with flickering lights and a cashier who barely looked up. She pulled out the card, her thumb running over its edge. "Hey," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Can you check if this works?" The cashier, a bored guy with a faded name tag, Tony, took the card and swiped it. His eyebrows shot up. Yeah, it's good. No limit." He handed it back, eyeing her like she'd just walked in with a crown on her head. "Where'd you get that?" Nova didn't answer. She bought a pack of gum, the cheapest thing she could think of, and left. No limit. The words echoed in her head all the way back to her tiny apartment, where the walls were thin and the sink always dripped. She sat on her lumpy couch, the card on the coffee table in front of her, staring at it like it might speak. Who was Elijah Maddox? And why her? Back in the penthouse, Elijah stood at the window, watching the lights of the city flicker to life. He'd seen her take the card. Good. He hadn't been sure she would. Most people would have hesitated longer, asked questions, or left it behind out of fear. But not her. There was a spark in her, something he couldn't name. He coughed, a dry rattling sound that made his ribs ache. The doctors had given him months, maybe less. The treatments weren't working anymore. He didn't have time for games, but this wasn't a game. It was a test. The next morning, Nova returned. She didn't have to. She could have taken the card and run, disappeared into a life she'd never dreamed of. But something pulled her back. Maybe it was the mystery of it all, or maybe it was the way Elijah's silence had felt less like arrogance and more like loneliness. She let herself in with the key the agency had given her, the penthouse as quiet as it had been the day before. He was there, though. She could feel it. "Morning," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. She didn't expect him to answer, but she wanted him to know she wasn't invisible. Elijah stepped out of the study, his frame leaner than it should have been, his suit impeccable despite the shadows under his eyes. "You came back," he said, his voice low, almost surprised. "You told me to," she replied, setting her bag down. She pulled the card from her pocket and held it up. "What's this about?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room, stopping a few feet from her. Up close, she could see the lines etched into his face, the way his hands trembled slightly before he clasped them behind his back. "It's yours," he said finally. "No strings. No catch. I just wanted to see what you'd do with it." Nova frowned, her grip tightening on the card. "Why me?" "Why not you?" he countered, his gaze steady. "You're here. You're real. Most people in this place, they're ghosts. They take what they can and vanish. You didn't." She studied him, searching for the lie. There wasn't one. Not that she could see. "I bought gum," she said, a small, dry laugh escaping her. "That's it. No limit, and I bought gum." Elijah's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. "It's a start." "A start to what?" she pressed, stepping closer. She wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to," he said, turning toward the window. "Not yet." Nova wanted to push, to demand answers, but something in his voice stopped her. It wasn't arrogance or dismissal. It was exhaustion, layered with something deeper. She slipped the card back into her pocket and picked up her cleaning supplies. "Fine. I'll be back tomorrow." "I know," he said, not turning around. She worked in silence again, but this time it felt different. charged, like they'd crossed a line neither of them could name. When she finished, she found another note on the table by the door, this one shorter. "Buy something bigger tomorrow." She stared at it, her pulse quickening. What was he playing at? And why did she want to find out? That night, Elijah sat in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. He'd built an empire, tech, investments, a name that opened doors across the world, but none of it mattered now. The doctors had made that clear. His legacy was crumbling, his body failing, and the only person who'd surprised him in years was a cleaner with steady hands and sharp eyes. He didn't know why he'd given her the card. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was hope. Either way, she'd come back. That was enough for now. Nova, meanwhile, lay awake in her apartment, the card on her nightstand. She could leave, take it and start over somewhere else, pay off her family's debts, get her little brother out of that dead-end neighborhood. But she wouldn't. Not yet. Elijah Maddox was a puzzle, and she'd never been able to walk away from a challenge. She closed her eyes, the note's words looping in her mind. Buy something bigger tomorrow. The words taunted her, daring her to step into a world she'd never belonged to. She could have done it, walked into a store, swiped the card and changed her life. But every time she thought about it, her stomach twisted. It wasn't hers. Not really. By morning, she'd made up her mind. She slipped the card into her pocket, grabbed her cleaning bag, and headed back to the penthouse, the weight of her decision steadying her steps. The elevator doors slid open, and there it was again, that pristine, silent expanse of Elijah Maddox's world. She set her bag down, louder than necessary, and waited. He appeared moments later, emerging from the study like a shadow taking shape. His eyes locked on her, searching, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Nova pulled the card from her pocket and held it out. "Here," she said, her voice firm. "I didn't use it." Elijah froze, his brow furrowing as he stared at the card in her outstretched hand. "You didn't use it," he echoed, the words hanging between them. It wasn't a question, but there was something in his tone, surprise, maybe even disbelief. "Because I didn't earn it," she said, meeting his gaze. She dropped her arm but kept the card in her fingers, rolling it between them like a coin. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but I'm not a charity case, or a toy." He stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back, though she noticed the slight tremor in them again. "You think that's what this is? Charity? What else could it be?" she shot back. "You don't know me. You don't even talk to me. And then you hand me this, like it's nothing to you, and expect me to just... What? Play along?" Elijah studied her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded toward the couch. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a command, but it wasn't a request either. "Please." Nova hesitated. Every instinct told her to leave, to drop the card and walk out. But there was something in his eyes, something raw, unguarded, that made her stay. She crossed the room and sat, the leather cool against her jeans. He didn't join her. Instead, he stood by the window, the city sprawling out behind him like a painting he'd grown tired of. "You're right," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I don't know you, but I've watched people my whole life, employees, partners, friends who weren't friends. They all take. They always do. You didn't." Nova frowned, leaning forward. "So this was a test?" "Not exactly." He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw the exhaustion carved into him, the way his shoulders sagged just slightly, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "I wanted to see who you are, not what you'd take." She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "And what am I supposed to do with that? You're still a stranger, a rich stranger who leaves cryptic notes and stares at me while I clean your floors." Elijah's lips quirked, a ghost of a smile. "Fair. But you came back. Twice. Why?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it, searching for an answer she wasn't sure she had. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe because you're not what I expected." "And what did you expect?" he asked, tilting his head. "Someone colder, meaner, the kind of guy who'd fire me for touching his stuff." She shrugged, glancing at the card still in her hand. "Not this." He nodded, like that made sense to him. Then he surprised her. "Stay," he said. "Not to clean, just talk." Nova blinked. "Talk? About what?" "Anything," he said, crossing to the armchair across from her and sitting down. He moved slowly, like every step cost him something. "Tell me why you bought gum." She laughed again, this time softer. "It was the first thing I saw. I didn't know what else to do with a card that could buy a house." "You could have bought a house," he pointed out, leaning back. "Why didn't you?" "Because I don't want your life," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "No offense, it's just, this place feels empty. I'd rather have something real." Elijah didn't respond right away. He just watched her, his gaze steady but softer now, like she'd said something he hadn't heard in a long time. "Real," he murmured almost to himself. "I forgot what that feels like." The silence stretched, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was something else. Nova set the card on the table between them. "Keep it," she said. "I don't need it." "I don't either," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'd like you to stay." She did. They talked, awkwardly at first, stumbling over words and silences. She told him about her brother stuck in a neighborhood that chewed people up, and her mom who worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. He listened, really listened, and when he spoke, it wasn't about his wealth or his empire. It was about the quiet moments, how he used to sit on a fire escape as a kid, dreaming of a life bigger than the one he had. How he'd built that life, only to find it hollow. "Why do you keep going?" she asked at one point, her legs tucked under her on the couch. "If it's so empty, why not stop?" He looked at her, his eyes sharp again, despite the weariness. "Because stopping means dying, and I'm not ready for that." The words hung there, heavier than anything he'd said before. Nova didn't press, but she felt it. The crack in his wall, the first glimpse of the man behind the suit. She didn't know why he'd let her see it or why she cared, but she did. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the room in gold, Nova stood to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said, pausing at the door. "Not for the card, just to talk." Elijah nodded, a faint flicker of relief crossing his face. "Good." She left the penthouse with empty hands but a mind full of questions. Who was he really? And what was he hiding? The city pulsed around her, but all she could hear was his voice. "I'm not ready for that." She didn't know it yet, but that moment, their first real conversation, was the beginning of something neither of them could escape. If someone offered you a blank check with no strings, would you accept it? Comment below and tell us your honest answer. Nova left the penthouse that evening with Elijah's words echoing in her mind. "I'm not ready for that." The vulnerability in his voice clung to her, a quiet thread pulling her back to him, despite the strangeness of it all. She didn't understand why she'd agreed to return, not for the card, not for the job, but for him. Maybe it was the way he'd listened, or the way his world, so vast and polished, felt smaller when he spoke. Whatever it was, she couldn't shake it. The city lights blurred past her as she walked home, her thoughts tangled in the man who'd gone from a silent observer to someone she couldn't stop wondering about. The next morning she arrived at the penthouse as promised. The air felt different, thicker somehow, like the silence had weight. She called out a casual "morning," expecting his usual slow emergence from the study. Nothing. She set her bag down, her pulse ticking up a notch. "Elijah!" Her voice bounced off the marble floors, unanswered. She moved toward the study, her steps quickening. The door was ajar, and there he was, slumped on the floor, his suit jacket crumpled around him, a glass shattered beside his outstretched hand. "Elijah!" Nova dropped to her knees, her hands hovering over him. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, his breathing shallow and ragged. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced it down. She grabbed her phone, dialing emergency services with trembling fingers. "He's not moving. Please, hurry," she said, her voice breaking as she gave the address. She stayed with him, her hand on his wrist, feeling the faint, erratic pulse beneath her fingers. "Come on, don't do this," she muttered, willing him to open his eyes. The paramedics arrived in a blur of motion, their voices sharp and clipped as they lifted him onto a stretcher. Nova followed, her mind racing. She didn't belong here, not in this moment, not in his life, but she couldn't leave. They let her ride in the ambulance, her presence unchallenged as she sat by his side, watching the machines beep and the medics work. His hand twitched once, and she grabbed it without thinking, holding tight. At the hospital, the chaos slowed to a sterile hum. Nova paced the waiting room, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. A doctor approached her, tall, graying, with a clipboard in hand. "You're with Mr. Maddox?" he asked, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Yeah," she said, swallowing hard. "Is he okay?" The doctor glanced at his notes, then back at her. "He's stable for now, but I need to be straight with you. He's got a rare condition. Degenerative. It's been eating at him for years, and it's progressing faster than we'd hoped. He's got months, maybe less." Nova's breath caught, the words sinking in like stones. "Months," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "He's dying." The doctor nodded, his expression softening. "He's awake now. Asked for you. Room 412. She didn't wait for more. She found the room, pushing the door open to see Elijah propped up in a hospital bed, an IV line snaking from his arm. He looked smaller here, stripped of the penthouse's grandeur, but his eyes still held that sharp intensity. "You're here," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You scared the hell out of me," she replied, stepping closer. She stopped at the edge of the bed, her hands clenched at her sides. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked away toward the window where the city skyline loomed distant and gray. "Didn't see the point. It's not your burden." "It is now," she said, sharper than she meant. "I found you like that. I'm not just walking away." Elijah turned back to her, surprise flickering across his face. "You don't owe me anything, Nova." "Maybe not," she said, pulling a chair closer and sitting down. "But I'm here. Deal with it." A faint smile tugged at his lips, gone as quickly as it came. He shifted, wincing slightly, then met her gaze. "Stay close," he said, the words quiet but firm. "Please, I don't want to do this alone." Nova's throat tightened. She didn't know what this meant, not fully, but she felt the weight of it, the unspoken plea beneath his request. "Okay," she said, her voice softening. "I'll stay." The room fell silent save for the steady beep of the monitor. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the shift happening within these walls. Elijah's hand rested on the bed, inches from hers, and though she didn't take it, she felt its presence like a lifeline. He was dying, and yet here she was, tethered to him in a way she couldn't explain. What came next, she didn't know, but one thing was clear. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Nova sat by Elijah's hospital bed, the steady beep of the monitor filling the silence between them. His request, "Stay close," had rooted her to that chair, her mind spinning with the reality of his words. He was dying. Months, maybe less. She barely knew him, yet the thought of walking away felt impossible. His hand rested near hers, unmoving, and though she didn't reach for it, the space between them buzzed with something unspoken. She stayed until the nurses ushered her out, promising to return the next day. As she left, Elijah's eyes followed her, a flicker of gratitude in them that she couldn't unsee. The following morning she arrived at the hospital just as the sun broke over the city. Elijah was sitting up when she entered room 412, his color slightly better, though the IV still trailed from his arm. He looked at her, his expression unreadable but softer than before. "You came back," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Told you I would," Nova replied, dropping into the chair beside him. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," he said, a dry chuckle escaping him. "But I felt worse." She nodded, unsure what to say next. The air felt heavy, charged with questions neither of them had voiced yet. Elijah broke the silence first, his gaze steady on her. "I've been thinking," he said, pausing to draw a slow breath. "About what happens next." Nova tilted her head, waiting. "Next?" "I don't have long," he continued, his words deliberate. "You heard the doctor. Months, if I'm lucky. And I don't want to spend them alone in that penthouse or here, with strangers poking at me." He shifted, wincing slightly, then met her eyes again. "I want you to stay with me. Be my companion, until the end." The offer hung there, bold and unexpected. Nova blinked, leaning back in her chair as her mind raced. "Your companion," she repeated, testing the word. "What does that even mean?" "It means you'd be there," he said simply. "Talk to me. Keep me company. Live in the penthouse if you want. I take care of you, money, whatever you need. Not charity," he added quickly, catching the flicker of resistance in her expression. "A deal. Between us." She stared at him, her pulse ticking up. "You're asking me to... what? Watch you die?" Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to live with me while I do. There's a difference." Nova let out a sharp breath, running a hand through her hair. "That's a lot, Elijah. I barely know you, and you're dropping this on me like it's nothing." "It's not nothing," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's everything. I've spent years building walls, keeping people out, but you walked through them without even trying. I don't know why, but I trust you, and I don't have time to figure it out." She looked away, her thoughts a tangle of doubt and curiosity. The black card flashed in her memory. His first test, one she'd rejected. This was bigger, heavier. "Why me?" she asked, echoing her question from days ago. "You could hire someone. A nurse, a friend, anyone." "I don't want anyone," he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "I want you. You're real. You don't bend to me. You don't run. I need that." Nova studied him, searching for the catch. There wasn't one, not on the surface anyway, but the weight of it pressed on her chest. "And what do I get out of this?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Besides money I don't want?" "Whatever you ask for," he said. "Name it." She didn't hesitate. "Honesty," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "If I do this, you don't hide anything. No cryptic notes, no half-truths. You tell me what's going on, about you, your life, this, whatever this is. I'm not signing up to be kept in the dark." Elijah nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Deal," he said. "Complete honesty. Starting now." "Okay," she said, the word slipping out before she could second-guess it. "I'll do it." A faint smile crossed his face, relief softening the lines around his eyes. "Thank you," he said, the words quieter than she'd expected. He leaned back, exhaling like a weight had lifted. "You won't regret it." "Don't make me," she shot back, but there was a trace of a smile on her lips too. The agreement settled between them, fragile but binding. Nova didn't know what she'd just stepped into, only that it felt like a threshold, one she couldn't uncross. Elijah watched her, his gaze steady, and for the first time she saw something like hope in him. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware of the pact forming in that sterile room, a pact that would tie them together in ways neither could yet fathom. Nova left the hospital that day with Elijah's agreement sealed in her mind, a quiet pact that felt both surreal and inevitable. Honesty, she'd demanded, and he'd promised it. The weight of her decision followed her home, mingling with the hum of the city as she replayed their conversation. She'd agreed to be his companion, to live with him, to face his final days. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something deeper, something she wasn't ready for. Still, she'd said yes, and she meant it. The next afternoon, she returned to the hospital, her resolve firm. Elijah was out of bed now, standing by the window in a plain white shirt and slacks, the IV gone. He turned as she entered, a faint spark in his eyes. "You're back," he said, his voice steadier than before. "Promised I would be," she replied, dropping her bag by the door. "You look better." "Looks can lie," he said, but there was a dry humor in it. He gestured to the chair. "Sit. We've got a deal to uphold." Nova sat, crossing her arms. "All right. Honesty. You start." Elijah nodded, easing into the chair across from her. He leaned forward, hands clasped, and for a moment, he didn't speak. Then, slowly, he began. "I grew up with nothing," he said, his voice low. "No family worth mentioning. My father left when I was a kid. My mother drank herself into a haze. I raised myself, more or less. Built everything I have from scratch, every dollar, every deal. But it came at a cost." Nova listened, her gaze steady. "What cost?" "People," he said simply. "I never let anyone close. Couldn't afford to. Trust was a luxury I didn't have, and love." He paused, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. "Love was a myth. I had women, sure. Relationships, if you could call them that, but they were transactions, cold, empty. I didn't know how to do it any other way." She tilted her head, studying him. "And now? You're dying, and you're alone. That's why I'm here?" He met her eyes, unflinching. "Yes. I've got no one else. No kids, no wife, no friends who'd stick around for this. Just you." The rawness of it hit her, but she didn't look away. "That's heavy," she said, her voice softer. "But I get it." "Your turn," he said, leaning back. "What's your story, Nova? Why'd you say yes?" She exhaled, her fingers tightening around her arms. "I don't talk about this much," she started, her tone guarded. "But you asked for honesty, so here it is. I grew up broke, paycheck to paycheck, sometimes less. My mom worked herself to death for us. And my dad, he was a ghost. Left when I was 10. Then there was this guy, my ex. Thought he was my way out. He wasn't. He was mean, controlling. Hit me when he felt like it. I stayed too long until I couldn't anymore. Got out, got this job. Been scraping by ever since." Elijah's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "He's still around?" "No," she said quickly. "Gone. But it sticks with you, you know. Makes you careful." He nodded, his gaze softening. "You're not careful with me." "You're different," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I don't know why, but you are." The air shifted, thickening with something neither of them named. Elijah leaned forward again, his voice dropping. "I don't deserve that. You know that, right?" "Maybe," she said, her eyes locked on his. "But I'm here anyway." Silence stretched, heavy and electric. Nova felt it, the pull, the tension building since that first note, that first conversation. She didn't move, but her breath hitched as Elijah reached out, his hand brushing hers. His touch was tentative, warm against her skin, and she didn't pull away. "Nova," he said, his voice rough, almost a question. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she closed the distance, her hand sliding up to his cheek, feeling the faint stubble there. He froze for a heartbeat, then leaned in, his lips meeting hers. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, like they were testing the edge of something fragile. Then it deepened, a quiet desperation threading through it, his fear, her defiance, their shared need for something real. Her fingers curled into his shirt. His hand found the back of her neck, and for a moment the world outside that room didn't exist. When they pulled apart, breathless, Nova rested her forehead against his. "This wasn't part of the deal," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "No," he agreed, his voice low. "But I'm not sorry." "Me neither," she said, pulling back to look at him. His eyes held hers, a mix of wonder and something deeper, something that scared her as much as it drew her in. The hospital room faded into the background, the beeping machines a distant hum. They'd crossed a line, secrets laid bare, sparks igniting, and there was no going back. What lay ahead was uncertain, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They had this, and for now it was enough. Nova pulled back from the kiss, her forehead still resting against Elijah's, the warmth of his breath mingling with hers. The hospital room felt smaller now, the air charged with the weight of what they'd just shared. Secrets spilled, walls cracked open, and a connection neither had expected. She could still feel the press of his lips, the quiet intensity in his touch, and it anchored her even as her mind spun. They sat there, caught in the moment, until the faint beep of the monitor reminded her where they were. She smiled faintly, brushing her thumb across his cheek before sitting back, the spark between them lingering like a promise. The next day, Nova returned with a quiet determination. Elijah was sitting up in bed, a tray of untouched hospital food beside him, his gaze distant until she walked in. "You're late," he said, a teasing edge to his voice. "Had to fight the traffic," she shot back, dropping into the chair. "You surviving this place?" "Barely," he said, his lips twitching. "You?" She shrugged, leaning forward. "I'm here, aren't I?" Their banter felt easy now, a rhythm they'd slipped into without trying. But beneath it, something gnawed at her, a question she couldn't shake. She'd seen the charts on his bedside table the day before, caught fragments of the doctor's words, degenerative, rare, months. She'd promised honesty, and so had he. It was time to dig deeper. "Elijah," she said, her tone shifting, "what's the deal with your condition?" "You've told me it's bad, but what are they doing about it?" He stiffened, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Nothing," he said, the word clipped. "There's nothing they can do." Nova frowned, leaning closer. "Nothing. At all. You've got money, resources. There's got to be something." He shook his head, a shadow crossing his face. "It's not that simple. It's rare. Experimental stuff's out there, but it's a long shot. I'm not chasing miracles." Her gut twisted. She'd heard that tone before. Resignation, fear masquerading as logic. She wasn't letting it slide. "What kind of experimental stuff?" she pressed, her voice firm. Elijah sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "There's a surgery. Abroad. Some clinic in Switzerland. They've had success with cases like mine, but it's risky. Invasive. Could kill me faster than the disease." I said no. Nova stared at him, disbelief flaring. "You said no. You've got a chance, a real chance, and you're just giving up?" "It's not giving up," he snapped, his eyes flashing. "It's facing reality. I've lived my life on my terms. I'm not rolling the dice on some butcher's table halfway across the world." She stood, pacing to the window and back, her frustration boiling over. "That's bullshit, Elijah. You're scared. I get it. Surgery's terrifying. Dying's terrifying. But you don't get to sit here and act like this is noble. You've got a shot and you're throwing it away." He glared at her, his jaw tight. "You don't know what you're talking about. You think it's easy. I've seen the stats. Half the people don't make it through. I'd rather go out my way than strapped to a machine, hoping for a maybe." Nova stopped, turning to face him fully. Her voice softened, but it carried steel. "You taught me something, you know. Back when you gave me that card when we started talking, you showed me how to face my pain, my ex, my past, all of it. I was running from it until you made me look at it. Now it's my turn. Let me help you face yours." Elijah's expression faltered, the anger draining from him. He looked away, his hands clenching the bedsheet. "Nova, No," she cut in, stepping closer. "Don't. You don't get to push me away now. You asked me to stay, to be here. This is me being here. You've got a chance to live, not just survive, but live. Take it. Let me help you." He didn't respond right away. The room grew still, the tension coiling tight. Finally, he met her gaze, his eyes raw and unguarded. "What if I can't?" he whispered. "What if I'm not strong enough?" "Then I'll be strong for you," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand finding his. "We'll do it together." Elijah stared at her, the fight leaching out of him. He squeezed her hand, his grip shaky but firm. "You're impossible," he muttered, a faint, reluctant smile breaking through. "Yeah," she said, smiling back, "and you're stuck with me." The decision hung unspoken, but she saw it in his eyes, the shift, the crack in his resolve. He hadn't said yes, not yet, but the door was open. Nova felt it, the twist, the spark of hope amid the fear. They were in this now, deeper than ever, and whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. Would you risk everything to save someone who tried to give up on themselves? Share your thoughts below. Nova sat on the edge of Elijah's hospital bed, her hand clasped in his, the air between them thick with the weight of her words. "We'll do it together." She'd pushed him, hard, and now she saw the shift in his eyes, the flicker of something breaking through the fear. He hadn't said yes, not outright, but the way he held her hand, the way his gaze softened, told her he was teetering on the edge. She didn't let go, didn't back down, and in that quiet, charged moment, she knew she'd gotten through. "I don't know how you do it," Elijah said finally, his voice rough but steady. "Make me want to try." "You're worth it," she replied, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "That's how." He exhaled, a shaky breath, then nodded. "Okay," he said, the words small but seismic. "I'll do it. The surgery, Switzerland, but only if you're there." Nova's heart stuttered, relief flooding her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, squeezing his hand. "We're in this." The decision settled over them, a fragile hope taking root. The next few days blurred. Discharge papers, private calls to the clinic, arrangements for the flight. Elijah was released from the hospital, weaker than he'd admit, and they returned to the penthouse together. Nova moved in, her small duffel bag a stark contrast to the sprawling luxury around her. It felt strange, living in his world, but it was theirs now, at least for this moment. The night before the flight, the city glittered beyond the penthouse windows, a restless hum against the stillness inside. Elijah stood by the glass, his silhouette sharp despite the weariness in his frame. Nova watched him from the couch, her chest tight with a mix of fear and something deeper, something that had grown since that first kiss. She stood, crossing the room to him. "You're quiet," she said, stopping beside him. "Thinking," he replied, turning to her. His eyes traced her face, lingering. "About tomorrow, about you." "Don't think too hard," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You'll wear yourself out." He chuckled, low and warm, then reached for her hand. "I don't deserve you," he murmured, pulling her closer. "You keep saying that," she said, stepping into his space, her hands resting on his chest. "Maybe I don't deserve you either." Elijah didn't argue this time. Instead, he leaned down, his lips finding hers in a kiss that started soft but quickly deepened, a hunger breaking through the restraint. Her fingers curled into his shirt, his hands slid to her waist, and the world narrowed to just them. They stumbled toward the bedroom, a trail of shed clothes marking their path, his jacket, her sweater, the barriers between them falling away. The night unfolded in a rush of heat and need, their bodies pressed close, every touch a defiance of the uncertainty ahead. He whispered her name against her skin, his voice raw, and she held him tighter, pouring everything she couldn't say into the way she moved with him. It was more than passion. It was a promise, a tether to hold on to as they faced the unknown. They made love with an intensity that left them breathless, tangled in the sheets as the city lights flickered outside, oblivious to the miracle unfolding within. Hours later they lay together, her head on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, his voice soft in the dark, "this was worth it." "Yeah," she whispered, her hand resting over his. "It was." Morning came too fast. Elijah left for the airport, Nova by his side, her resolve unshaken as they boarded the private jet to Switzerland. She didn't let herself think about the risks, only the chance, the hope they'd fought for. He squeezed her hand as the plane took off, a silent vow between them. Days later, back in the penthouse alone while Elijah underwent the surgery, Nova felt off, tired, queasy, a nagging pull she couldn't place. She brushed it off as stress until it hit her, sharp and sudden in the middle of the kitchen. Her breath caught as she counted the days, her mind racing back to that night. She bought a test, hands shaking as she waited for the result. 2 lines stared back at her, undeniable. She was pregnant. Nova sank onto the couch, the stick clutched in her hand, a storm of emotions crashing through her. Joy, fear, wonder. She didn't know what to feel first. Elijah was fighting for his life halfway across the world, and here she was, carrying a piece of him. A miracle she hadn't seen coming. She pressed a hand to her stomach, tears prickling her eyes. Whatever happened next, whether he came back to her or not, this changed everything. Nova sat on the penthouse couch, the pregnancy test still in her hand, her mind a whirlwind of shock and fragile hope. She was pregnant, carrying Elijah's child, a secret born from their last night together before he'd left for Switzerland. The memory of his touch, his whispered words, clung to her as she pressed a hand to her stomach, tears slipping down her cheeks. He was fighting for his life in that clinic, and now she had this, a piece of him, a future she hadn't dared imagine. She didn't know if he'd make it back, but she held on to the thought of telling him, of seeing his face when she did. It was enough to keep her steady as she waited for news. The days stretched into weeks, the silence from Switzerland growing heavier with each passing hour. Nova stayed in the penthouse, surrounded by Elijah's world, his books, his art, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. She called the clinic daily at first, her voice tight with worry, but the responses were always the same. "The procedure is ongoing, no updates yet." Then the calls stopped connecting, the line going dead, and her emails bounced back unanswered. Dread crept in, cold and relentless, but she fought it, clinging to the promise they'd made. "We'll do it together." A month passed, then 2. The silence became a void, swallowing her hope bit by bit. Nova paced the penthouse, her hand resting on her stomach where the faintest curve was beginning to show. She'd stopped sleeping, her dreams haunted by images of Elijah, his smile, his collapse, a sterile operating room she couldn't reach. One morning, the phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. Her heart leapt, but the voice on the other end wasn't his. It was a lawyer, clipped and formal, informing her that Elijah's accounts were being frozen, his estate put on hold. "Pending confirmation of his status," the man said, and the line went dead. That was it. No word, no proof, just an absence that felt final. Nova sank to the floor, the phone slipping from her hand. He was gone. He had to be. The surgery, too risky, too experimental, had taken him, and no one had bothered to tell her. Grief hit her like a wave, raw and choking. She curled into herself, sobbing for the man she'd barely begun to love, for the future they'd lost, for the child who'd never know him. "You promised," she whispered into the empty room, her voice breaking. "You promised you'd try." Days blurred into weeks. Nova couldn't stay in the penthouse. It was too big, too quiet, too full of him. She packed her things, leaving behind the black card and the notes he'd written, and moved into a small apartment across the city. It was modest, cramped, but hers, a place to start over. She found a job at a diner, the kind with sticky counters and late-night shifts, her pregnancy hidden under loose shirts. She grieved in pieces, letting the tears come when no one was looking, but she kept moving. For the baby, for herself. She named the child in her mind, Lila if it was a girl after her grandmother, Eli if it was a boy, a quiet nod to him. She bought a crib second-hand, painted it white with shaky hands, and set it up in the corner of her tiny bedroom. Friends from the diner pitched in, old blankets, a few onesies, small acts of kindness that kept her afloat. Nova built a life, fragile but real, out of the ashes of what she'd lost. She talked to her stomach late at night, her voice soft. "He would have loved you," she'd say, tracing circles over the growing bump. "He was stubborn, but he would have." The city moved on around her, indifferent to her quiet mourning. She stopped checking the news, stopped hoping for a call that never came. Elijah was gone. Dead, she told herself, because the alternative was too cruel to consider. She'd loved him, brief and fierce, and now she'd carry on alone. The silence was her answer, and she let it settle, heavy but final, as she prepared for the day she'd meet their child. Nova stood in her tiny apartment, the white crib gleaming faintly in the corner as she folded a stack of baby clothes, tiny socks, soft onesies, gifts from her diner co-workers. The months of silence had hardened into a quiet acceptance. Elijah was gone, lost to the surgery she'd pushed him toward. Her grief had softened with time, replaced by a steady resolve to build a life for the child growing inside her. At 6 months pregnant, her belly rounded beneath her worn sweater, she moved slower now, her hands often resting on the curve as she whispered to the baby, Lila or Eli, names that kept him close. The city buzzed outside, but here, in this small space, she'd found a fragile piece, piecing together a future from the wreckage of their brief, blazing connection. The knock came late, sharp against the hum of the evening. Nova frowned, setting down a folded blanket. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her shift at the diner had ended hours ago, and her friends knew she tired early these days. She crossed the room, her bare feet quiet on the worn floor, and opened the door. The sight stopped her cold. Elijah stood there, alive, breathing, his frame leaner than she remembered, but steady. His hair was shorter, his skin paler, but his eyes, those sharp, searching eyes, locked on hers with an intensity that stole her breath. He wore a simple coat, hands shoved deep in the pockets, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows across his face, but he was real. Impossibly, undeniably real. "Nova," he said, his voice low, rough with something she couldn't name. She stared, her hand gripping the doorframe, her knees threatening to buckle. You're alive," she whispered, the words trembling out of her. I thought you were dead." Elijah's expression cracked, guilt and relief warring in his gaze. "I almost was," he said, stepping closer. "The surgery, it went wrong. Complications. I was in a coma for weeks. Then recovery. They wouldn't let me contact anyone, not until I was stable. I tried to reach you, but you were gone from the penthouse. I've been looking for you ever since." Nova's mind reeled, months of grief and silence crashing against this moment. "Looking for me?" she said, her voice rising. "I called, Elijah. Every day until the lines went dead. They froze your accounts, said you were—" She choked on the word, tears burning her eyes. "I mourned you. I built a life without you because I had to." He flinched, his hands half reaching for her before dropping back. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I failed you. I should have fought harder to get word to you, but I'm here now. I'm alive because of you." She shook her head, stepping back into the apartment, her hand instinctively covering her stomach. "You don't get to just show up and say that," she said, anger threading through her pain. "I thought I'd lost you. I grieved you, Elijah. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" He followed her inside, the door clicking shut behind him. "I do," he said, his eyes tracing her face, then dropping to her belly. He froze, realization dawning. "Nova, you're pregnant," she finished, her voice steady despite the tears spilling over. "Yeah, 6 months. It's yours." Elijah's breath hitched, his hand rising to his mouth as he stared at her, then at the swell of her stomach. "Mine," he repeated, the word a whisper. He took a step closer, his eyes wide with wonder and something deeper, something raw. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," she said, wiping her face with her sleeve. "You were gone. I found out after you left for Switzerland. I was alone, Elijah. I thought I'd raise this kid without you." He closed the distance between them, his hands hovering near her arms, not quite touching. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick. "I never wanted that. I fought to come back, for you. You kept me alive, Nova. Every time I wanted to give up, I saw your face. I heard your voice telling me to face it. And now—" He paused, his gaze dropping to her stomach again, then back to her eyes. "I want to live for you, for both of you." Nova's chest tightened, the flood of emotions overwhelming, relief, fury, love, all tangled together. She wanted to push him away to protect the life she'd built, but his words cracked her open. "You can't just say that and make it okay," she said, her voice shaking. "I thought you were dead. I buried you in my head." "I know," he said, his hands finally settling on her arms, gentle but firm. "I'll spend every day making it up to you, if you'll let me. I'm not the man I was. The surgery worked, Nova. I'm not dying anymore. I'm here. And I want this, us, the baby, all of it." She looked up at him, searching his face for the lie, the catch. There wasn't one, just Elijah, scarred, alive and pleading. Her hand slid to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, proof he'd come back to her. "You're really here," she said, her voice softening, breaking. "I am," he said, pulling her closer. "And I'm not leaving again." She let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming as she pressed her forehead to his chest. His arms wrapped around her, careful but tight, and she felt the months of grief unraveling in his embrace. "I hate you for this," she muttered, her voice muffled against him. "Scaring me like that." "I know," he said, his lips brushing her hair. "Hate me all you want. Just don't send me away." Nova pulled back, meeting his gaze. "I won't," she said, the words a quiet surrender. "But you're on thin ice, Maddox." He smiled, faint but real, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "Fair enough." They stood there, the small apartment shrinking around them, the crib in the corner a silent witness to their reunion. She led him to it, her hand in his, and showed him the life she'd started building. "This is for Lila or Eli," she said, her voice steady now. "I didn't know if you'd ever see it." "Eli," he repeated, his eyes lighting up. "After me." "Maybe," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Don't get cocky." He laughed, the sound warm and alive, and pulled her close again. They talked for hours about the surgery, the coma, the months he'd spent searching for her, about her pregnancy, the diner, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep. The anger faded, replaced by a fragile trust, a shared ache that bound them tighter. She showed him the ultrasound photo, a grainy image of their child, and he stared at it, his fingers trembling as he traced the outline. "I missed so much," he said, his voice thick. "But I'm here now. I'll be here." Nova nodded, leaning into him. "You better be." The night stretched on, the city humming outside as they sat together on her worn couch, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting on her stomach. She felt the baby kick, a small, insistent nudge, and guided his hand to it. His breath caught, a quiet awe washing over him. "That's ours," he said, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," she said, her hand over his. "Ours." They stayed like that, the silence no longer heavy but full of them, of the life they'd almost lost, of the one they were gaining. Elijah kissed her then, slow and deep, a promise sealed in the quiet. "I love you," he said, the words raw and unpracticed. "I didn't know how to say it before, but I do." Nova's heart stumbled, the confession sinking in. "I love you too," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Even when I hated you." He laughed again, pulling her closer, and they held on, the past months fading into the strength of this moment. The road ahead was uncertain, new, uncharted, but they'd face it together. Elijah was back, alive and healthier than she'd ever seen him, a miracle she hadn't dared hope for. And now, with their child between them, they had everything to live for. The city lights flickered beyond the window, a quiet backdrop to their reunion as Nova nestled into him, her hand still on his, their future unfolding one breath at a time. Nova rested against Elijah on her worn couch, his arm around her, their hands joined over her swollen stomach where their baby kicked, a quiet, fierce reminder of the life they'd created. The night of his return had stretched into a fragile dawn, their reunion a tangle of tears, laughter, and promises. He'd come back to her, alive, healthier, a miracle she'd stopped believing in. And now they faced a future neither had dared imagine. The penthouse was a memory. This small apartment, with its second-hand crib and stacks of baby clothes, was their world now. They spent the weeks that followed rebuilding, learning each other again, planning for the child who'd arrive soon. Elijah stayed, his presence steady, his hands often finding hers as they navigated the unknown together. 3 months later, the air in the apartment grew sharp with anticipation. Nova's due date loomed, her body heavy and restless as she paced the small space, Elijah watching her with a mix of awe and worry. "You need to sit," he said, standing from the couch, his voice gentle but firm. "I can't," she shot back, a hand pressed to her lower back. "This kid's ready to move, and I'm not stopping him." He smiled, crossing to her. "Stubborn, both of you." "Learned from the best," she said, leaning into him as a contraction rippled through her. She gripped his arm, her breath hitching. "Okay, maybe it's time." The drive to the hospital was a blur, Elijah's steady voice cutting through her pain, his hand never leaving hers. They reached the maternity ward just as the contractions tightened, nurses ushering them into a room where the world shrank to the rhythm of her labor. Hours passed, each one a battle, Nova's strength waning, then surging, Elijah by her side, whispering encouragement. "You've got this," he said, his forehead pressed to hers during a rare pause. "You're incredible." "Shut up and hold my hand," she gasped, a laugh breaking through the strain. He did, his grip unwavering as she pushed, her body trembling with effort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a cry pierced the room, high, fierce, alive. Nova collapsed back, tears streaming as the nurse placed a squirming, red-faced baby boy on her chest. His tiny hands flailed, his eyes scrunched shut, and she laughed through her sobs, her fingers brushing his damp hair. "Hey, little man," she whispered, her voice raw. "You're here." Elijah leaned over, his breath catching as he looked at their son. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick, his hand resting on the baby's back. "Just like you." Nova glanced at him, her heart full. "We did this," she said, her eyes locked on his. "Together." The nurse hovered nearby, smiling. "What's his name?" Nova and Elijah shared a look, a silent agreement passing between them. "Zion," Nova said, the name soft but certain. "Zion Maddox." "Zion," Elijah repeated, testing it, his smile widening. "It fits him." The room settled into a quiet hum, the chaos of birth giving way to a fragile peace. Nova cradled Zion, his small weight anchoring her, while Elijah sat beside her, his arm around them both. They stayed like that for hours, watching him sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, offering congratulations, but the world beyond the hospital bed faded. It was just them, Nova, Elijah, and Zion, a family forged from loss and miracles. Later, as the afternoon light slanted through the window, Nova rested against the pillows, Zion nestled in her arms. Elijah stood, pacing briefly before stopping beside her. He looked nervous, more nervous than she'd ever seen him, even before the surgery. "What's wrong?" she asked, shifting Zion slightly. "Nothing's wrong," he said, his voice low. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Nova's breath caught as he sank to one knee beside the bed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Nova," he started, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You saved me. Not just with the surgery, you saved me long before that. You gave me a reason to fight, to live, and now you've given me him." He glanced at Zion, then back at her. "I don't want to go another day without you, both of you, as my family. Marry me." Nova stared at him, the box open in his hand, a simple silver ring glinting inside. Tears welled up again, happy ones this time, and she laughed, soft and shaky. "You're proposing now? Here?" "Couldn't wait," he said, a grin breaking through. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said, reaching for him with her free hand. "Yes, you idiot. Of course it's a yes." Elijah surged up, kissing her fiercely, careful not to jostle Zion. The baby stirred, letting out a small whimper, and they both laughed, pulling back to soothe him. Elijah slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch lingering as he looked at her, really looked at her, like she was the miracle he'd never expected. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you." "I love you too," she replied, her hand squeezing his. "Always." They sat together, Zion between them, the ring cool against her skin. The hospital room buzzed faintly, monitors beeping, footsteps in the hall. But it was theirs, this moment. Nova traced Zion's tiny fingers, marveling at how they curled around hers, while Elijah watched them both, his eyes bright with a future he'd once thought impossible. They talked late into the evening about the wedding, small and simple, maybe in the spring, about bringing Zion home, turning the apartment into a real space for three. Elijah promised to sell the penthouse, to start fresh with her, and she believed him. The night deepened and Nova drifted off, Zion in the bassinet beside her, Elijah's hand still in hers. He stayed awake, watching them, the weight of his old life gone, replaced by this. His family, his reason. He'd been a man alone, dying in a world of cold luxury, until she'd walked in with her steady hands and sharper heart. Now here they were, whole, alive, beginning. The next morning, sunlight streamed in, painting the room gold. Nova woke to Elijah holding Zion, humming softly, a peace in his face she'd never seen before. "You're good at that," she said, her voice sleepy. "Had a good teacher," he replied, nodding at her. He handed Zion to her and they sat together, the baby's warmth binding them closer. They'd faced death, silence, and the unknown, and come out the other side. Not unscathed, but stronger. This was their start, messy and beautiful, a family born from a miracle neither had seen coming. What would you name a child born from a miracle? Let's see your most beautiful names in the comments. Nova woke to the soft light of morning, filtering through the hospital room. Elijah cradling Zion in his arms, his low hum a gentle thread weaving through the quiet. The ring on her finger caught the sun, a simple silver band that felt like a promise made solid. They'd said yes, to each other, to this family, and the weight of it settled over her, warm and steady. Zion stirred, his tiny face scrunching before he settled back into sleep, and Nova reached out, brushing her fingers over his cheek. Elijah met her gaze, his smile soft but full, a man transformed by the life they'd built in that moment. They'd faced the impossible, his illness, the silence, the uncertainty, and emerged here together with their son. It was a beginning, raw and real, and she held it close as the day unfolded. Weeks later, they left the hospital as a family, Nova cradling Zion in a car seat while Elijah drove them back to the apartment. The city loomed around them, its restless energy a stark contrast to the quiet they carried. The small space welcomed them, crib in the corner, blankets draped over the couch, and though it was cramped, it felt right. Elijah set down their bags, his movements careful but stronger than they'd been months ago, the surgery's success etched into every step. "Home," he said, glancing at her, and she nodded, the word sinking in. The days that followed were a blur of new rhythms, late-night feedings, Zion's cries piercing the stillness, Elijah's hands learning the gentle art of soothing him. Nova watched him sometimes, marveling at the man who'd once lived behind walls of glass and steel, now rocking their son with a tenderness she hadn't known he possessed. They laughed through the exhaustion, argued over diaper changes, and stole moments of closeness when Zion slept. A kiss in the kitchen, a shared glance over coffee. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Months passed, Zion growing from a fragile newborn into a bright-eyed boy with Elijah's sharp gaze and Nova's stubborn streak. The apartment felt smaller with each milestone, his first smile, his first roll across the floor, and Elijah began to talk of change. "I'm done with the old life," he said one evening, Zion asleep in his lap, the city lights flickering beyond the window. "The company, the penthouse, it's not me anymore." Nova looked at him, her head tilted. "What's you, then?" He paused, his hand resting on Zion's back. "You, him, something real." He met her eyes, a spark igniting. "I want to build something, for you, for us, a healing center, in your name." She blinked, caught off guard. "A healing center?" "Yeah," he said, leaning forward. "For people like me, people who need a chance, a cure, someone to push them. You did that for me, Nova. I want to give that to others." The idea took root, growing over weeks of late-night talks. Elijah retired from his empire, selling off shares and properties with a decisiveness that surprised her. The penthouse went last, its cold luxury traded for a vision they shaped together. They found a quiet lakeside town hours from the city, rolling hills, water lapping at the shore, a place where the air felt clean and time slowed. It was a fresh start, a canvas for the life they wanted. Elijah poured his fortune into the Nova Chandler Healing Center, a sprawling facility with white walls and wide windows designed for hope. It offered experimental treatments, counseling, a space for those the world had given up on, just as she'd refused to give up on him. They moved into a house by the lake, a two-story home with a porch that creaked under their steps. It was modest compared to the penthouse, but alive. Zion's toys scattered across the floor, Nova's sketches pinned to the fridge, Elijah's books lining the shelves. The town embraced them, its people warm but unintrusive, and they settled into a rhythm that felt like breathing. Zion toddled through the grass by the water, his laughter ringing out as Elijah chased him, Nova watching from the porch with a mug of tea in her hands. "He's fast," Elijah called, scooping Zion up, both of them breathless and grinning. "Like his dad," she replied, her smile soft. "Stubborn, too." Elijah carried Zion over, setting him down to play with a pile of leaves. He sat beside her, his hand finding hers. "This is better than I dreamed," he said, his voice low. "You made this." "We made this," she corrected, squeezing his hand. "You're not off the hook." He laughed, the sound free and full, a far cry from the man she'd met in that sterile penthouse. The healing center opened that spring, its doors welcoming the first patients, men and women with shadowed eyes and fragile hope. Nova worked there part-time, her presence a quiet strength, while Elijah oversaw it all, his business mind tempered by a purpose he'd never known before. Zion grew alongside it, a wild-haired boy who loved the lake and his parents' stories, tales of a black card, a hospital room, a love that defied the odds. Years slipped by, the seasons painting the town in cycles of green and gold. Zion turned 5, then 6, his curiosity boundless. Why the sky changed colors, how fish breathed underwater, what made his dad's hands shake sometimes when he talked about the past. Nova and Elijah answered as best they could, their life a tapestry of small joys and steady love. The healing center thrived, its name a beacon for those in need, and though Elijah stepped back from daily operations, his vision lived on. He traded boardrooms for this. Mornings by the lake, evenings with Nova on the porch, Zion's voice calling them to see a frog or a star. One summer evening, the air thick with the scent of water and pine, they sat together as the sun dipped low, painting the lake in hues of orange and pink. Zion played nearby, chasing fireflies with a jar in his hands, his laughter a melody against the quiet. Nova leaned into Elijah, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. "You ever think about that first day?" she asked, her voice soft. "Every day," he said, his fingers tracing circles on her arm. "You walked in, cleaning my floors, and I didn't know you'd change everything." She smiled, tilting her head to look at him. "Didn't know you'd be such a pain, either." "Worth it, though," he said, his eyes warm. "You were my cure, Nova." "Still are." She pressed a kiss to his cheek, lingering there. "And you're mine." They watched Zion, his small figure darting through the dusk, the jar glowing with captured light. The town settled around them, its peace a gift they'd earned. She'd walked into his life as a cleaner, steady hands, sharp eyes, a spark he couldn't ignore, and stayed as his cure, the heart of a family neither had expected. The lake rippled gently, reflecting the last of the day's light, and in that moment their story felt complete. Not an end, but a beginning that stretched on, quiet and true. The house by the lake became their sanctuary, its walls holding the echoes of Zion's growth, his first words, Mama, followed by Dada. His wobbly steps across the hardwood, the crayon marks Nova framed instead of scrubbing away. Elijah built a swing by the water, its ropes creaking as Zion soared higher, his squeals drawing neighbors' smiles. Nova planted a garden, her hands in the soil as she taught Zion the names of flowers, daisies, lavender, sunflowers that turned to face the light. Elijah watched them, his chest tight with a gratitude he couldn't voice, a man remade by the love he'd found. The healing center grew, its reputation spreading beyond the town. Patients came from cities, from across state lines drawn by stories of a place that didn't give up. Nova led art classes there, her sketches turning into murals that lined the halls, bright, bold strokes of color that spoke of resilience. Elijah met with doctors, his mind sharp despite the years, ensuring the center stayed true to its purpose. They worked as a team, their strengths weaving together, and though the days were long, they ended them together. Home, the lake a mirror to their quiet nights. Zion started school, his backpack dwarfing his small frame as he waved from the bus stop. Nova cried that first day, Elijah's arm around her as they watched him go. "He's growing too fast," she said, wiping her eyes. "He's got time," Elijah replied, kissing her temple. "So do we." They filled their years with him, trips to the lake's edge, picnics under the trees, stories of the past that made Zion's eyes widen. "Did you really give Mama a magic card?" he asked once, sprawled on the porch with a popsicle dripping down his hand. "Not magic," Elijah said, grinning at Nova. "Just a key. She opened everything." Nova laughed, ruffling Zion's hair. "Your dad's a sap." "Only for you," he shot back, and Zion groaned, rolling his eyes at their mushiness. The town became their roots, its people their extended family. The diner crew visited, bringing casseroles and tales of Nova's old shifts. The center's first patients returned, some healed, some still fighting, all grateful. Elijah and Nova grew older together, her hair streaked with gray, his hands slower but steady. Yet their bond deepened, a quiet fire that never dimmed. Zion turned 10, then 12, his questions sharper, his dreams bigger, and they nurtured him, their love a foundation he'd carry always. One winter, snow blanketed the lake, turning the world white and still. They sat by the fire, Zion reading in the corner, Nova curled against Elijah under a quilt. "This is it, isn't it?" she said, her voice a whisper. "The life we wanted." "Yeah," he said, his hand finding hers. "More than I knew to want." She smiled, resting her head on his chest, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. Zion looked up, catching their moment, and grinned, a boy who'd grown up in the glow of their love. The healing center stood strong, a legacy in her name. But this, their home, their son, their quiet days, was the true miracle. She'd walked into his life as a cleaner, a stranger with a rag and a purpose, and stayed as his cure, the woman who'd given him everything. The snow fell outside, soft and endless, and they held on to each other, to Zion, to the life they'd built from a chance and a card. It was enough, more than enough. Was this story what you expected? Did it touch you in any way? Let's hear your reflections in the comments. And if you believe in love that heals, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next one.